This is Democracy Now!
The decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind.
A message from the future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The New York Congress member collaborates with The Intercept and illustrator Molly Crabapple to produce a video set decades from now, looking back at how the Green New Deal transformed the nation. We'll air the video and hear from Naomi Klein, Molly Crabapple, and Avi Lewis on the Green New Deal and the link between art and politics. Then, as Attorney General William Barr prepares to release the Mueller report, we speak to world-renowned linguist and political dissident Noam Chomsky.
As far as Trump collusion with the Russians, that was never going to amount to anything more than minor corruption. Maybe building a Trump hotel in Red Square or something like that, but nothing of any significance. The Democrats invested everything in this issue. Well, turned out there was nothing much there. They gave Trump a huge gift. In fact, they may have handed him the next election.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Attorney General William Barr is releasing Robert Mueller's long-anticipated report into Russian interference in the 2016 election, with large portions of the more than 300-page document redacted. Barr says he's withholding parts of the report in order to protect the personal privacy of third parties, to avoid compromising intelligence sources and methods, and to protect grand jury material and ongoing investigations. Barr is set to hold a news conference at 9:30 a.m. ahead of the report's release, which is expected sometime after 11 a.m. House Judiciary Committee Chair Gerald Nadler said Wednesday Barr was hoping to spin the report to paper over damning evidence of misdeeds by President Trump and his associates.
The fact that the Attorney General is not releasing even the redacted report to Congress until after his press conference will again result in the report being presented through his own words rather than through the words of Special Counsel Mueller. The central concern here is that the Attorney General Barr is not allowing the facts of the Mueller report to speak for themselves, but is trying to bake in the narrative about the report to the benefit of the White House.
The Mueller report's release comes after Justice Department officials reportedly held numerous conversations with White House lawyers about the document in recent days. Barr has said the report shows no evidence President Trump or his associates colluded with Russia. The Justice Department said it's sending Congress a different version of the Mueller report with fewer redactions. Democratic lawmakers are demanding the release of the full Mueller report and have said they'll subpoena the entire document as early as Friday. The Trump administration said Wednesday it's further tightening sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, announced the sanctions during a belligerent speech in Miami, mocking the presidents of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as the, quote, three stooges of socialism. Bolton was addressing veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion as they mark the 58th anniversary of the failed CIA plot to overthrow Fidel Castro.
Under this administration, we don't throw dictators lifelines. We will take them away. Today, we proudly proclaim for all to hear the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.
The heaviest sanctions will fall on Cuba. They'll severely limit the amount of money people in the U.S. can remit to relatives on the island. Meanwhile, U.S. citizens will be allowed to sue companies that do business in Cuba using property that was repatriated by the Cuban Revolution. The sanctions drew immediate condemnation from countries around the world, with U.S. allies in Europe and Canada promising counter lawsuits and a challenge at the World Trade Organization. This is former Cuban diplomat Carlos Azugaray responding from Havana.
The United States thinks that those octogenarians who were defeated at the Bay of Pigs will win something, but they probably won't get anything. What I would say to Cubans is, who's going to take this away from us? We are here. The properties are here. They're not on the moon or in the United States.
North Korea says it tested a new type of short-range guided weapon Wednesday in its first public acknowledgement of a weapons test since President Trump walked away from a U.S.-North Korea summit in Hanoi in February without a deal. North Korea also said it no longer wants U.S. Secretary Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to play a role in negotiations on denuclearization. A statement by the Korean Central News Agency said negotiators want someone to take the lead in talks who's, quote, more careful and mature in communicating, unquote. North Korea's moves came as the Trump administration suddenly halted without explanation a long-standing practice of declassifying the current size of the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal. Last year, the State Department declared the U.S. has stockpiled 3,822 nuclear warheads. In Peru, the former president, Alan Garcia, died by suicide Wednesday as police arrived at his home in Lima to arrest him on charges of bribery and corruption. Police say Garcia shot himself in the neck as he faced the prospect of prison for the first time. Garcia served 2 5-year terms as president beginning in 1985, again in 2006, returning to Peru from exile in 2001 only after the statute of limitations on corruption charges stemming from his first term in office expired. He was the 5th former head of state in Peru to face investigation for alleged corruption. Back in the United States, police in Colorado say they discovered the body of a Florida teenager Wednesday after she allegedly threatened to mark the 20th anniversary of the Columbine High School shootings with a massacre of her own. 18-year-old Sol Pais was found in the mountains west of Denver, dead of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police said Pais was infatuated with the Columbine massacre and traveled to Denver Monday, buying a gun and ammunition before making threats that the FBI called credible but nonspecific. The threats prompted authorities to cancel Wednesday classes for more than 500,000 students across Colorado's Front Range. This is John McDonald, director of the Jefferson County Department of School Safety.
Looking at school shooters and the history of what we've seen for the last 20 years, there's some real indicators that we look at. The fact that she was committed, purchased a plane ticket, not only purchased a plane ticket, but made that journey, that pilgrimage to Columbine. Once she got into our area, purchased a gun.
Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner said Wednesday his office will no longer oppose a bid by imprisoned former Black Panther Mumia Abu-Jamal to re-argue his case. The move paves the way for Abu-Jamal to get a new hearing to appeal his 1981 conviction for the murder of Philadelphia police officer Daniel Faulkner. Mumia Abu-Jamal is an award-winning journalist who spent nearly 3 decades on death row. He remains in a Pennsylvania prison serving a sentence of life without parole. The New York State Parole Board has granted parole to prisoner Judith Clark, who drove a getaway car during a 1981 robbery in Rockland County that left a security guard and 2 police officers dead. The robbery was aimed at expropriating money from a Brinks armored car for the Republic of New Africa. Clark was sentenced to 75 years for second-degree murder and robbery, although she did not fire any shots. Clark's parole comes 2 years after Governor Andrew Cuomo commuted her sentence of 75 years to life, citing her exceptional strides in self-development. As a model prisoner who worked tirelessly to bring education, prenatal care, and AIDS counseling to fellow prisoners. She's scheduled for release from prison on May 15th. President Trump's daughter Ivanka Trump confirmed Wednesday her father offered her the role of World Bank president, but said she turned down the offer because she's happy in her role as senior White House advisor. Last week, President Trump told the Atlantic Monthly he offered his oldest daughter the role, quote, because she's very good with numbers. Bloomberg News is reporting former Texas Republican Governor Rick Perry is planning to leave his post as Secretary of the Department of Energy, where he worked to speed coal, oil, gas, and nuclear production while slashing federal funds for research and development into renewable energy. In 2012, Perry infamously forgot the name of the Department of Energy as he proposed abolishing 3 federal agencies during a Republican presidential debate. He was later tapped by President Trump to lead one of the agencies he wanted to do away with. At the Vatican, 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg was greeted by Pope Francis Wednesday as she continues to lead a campaign to press European leaders to act urgently on climate change. Last August, Thunberg began a series of school strikes on the climate outside the Swedish parliament, which quickly grew from a quiet one-girl weekly vigil to an international protest movement involving hundreds of thousands of school children. On Tuesday, Thunberg addressed the European Parliament, where she urged lawmakers to respond as urgently to climate change as they did when much of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral burned on Monday.
Yesterday, the world watched with despair and enormous sorrow how the Notre Dame burned in Paris. Some buildings are more than just buildings. But the Notre Dame will be rebuilt. I hope that its foundations are strong. I hope that our foundations are even stronger. But I fear they are not.
In London, climate activists with Extinction Rebellion group chained and superglued themselves to the home of UK Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn Wednesday as part of a third day of direct action protests aimed at spurring urgent action on climate change. Many of the protesters said they supported Corbyn but wanted his party to declare a national climate emergency. Elsewhere in London, protesters continue to occupy the busy Oxford Circus shopping district and superglue themselves to a train, delaying service. And in New York City, 62 climate activists with Extinction Rebellion were arrested after shutting down traffic and staging a die-in outside City Hall Wednesday. The demonstrators partially blocked access to the Brooklyn Bridge, lying down in the street and scaling stoplights to demand radical action on climate change. Democracy Now!'s Taya Studio and Libby Rainey were there.
You will be placed under arrest and charged with disorderly conduct in the room.
I'm Reverend Chelsea Macmillan, and this is Extinction Rebellion. We're joining rebels all over the world, standing up for climate change. We need to declare a climate emergency and take swift action to change the course of its human history right now. We're about to get arrested. We've been blocking this road, and we're here to show New York City that we're serious, that we need to do something now, and we need to do something fast about climate change.
How long are we going to let these profit-driven systems drive our nation? We have less than 12 years.
There's an emergency with the climate, and most people don't know the gravity of the situation, really. Watch climate videos.
This is the New York City Police Department. You are unlawfully in the roadway and obstructing vehicular traffic. You are ordered to leave the roadway and utilize the available sidewalk.
My name is Eve Mosier, and I'm here with Extinction Rebellion. We're here to get our New York City and New York State government to recognize that climate change is the most urgent issue of our time and that they need to act accordingly. The science shows that we have to make drastic reductions, and we have to make those reductions now. And so we're out here asking them to act like Mayor de Blasio has said it is an emergency, and we want him to act like it's an emergency. Extinction Rebellion has 4 demands in the U.S. We have the demand that the government and the media tell the truth about the urgency of climate change. We are asking for them to act now to maintain the ecosystem and get us to net zero by 2025, which is very aggressive. We're also asking for citizens' assemblies. We don't trust the government to do this on their own. We need oversight from citizens. And in the U.S., we're asking for a just transition, that we pay attention to the fact that we've caused harm to entire communities with our environmental economy, extractive economy, and we want something done about that.
I'm Ben Shepard of Brooklyn, New York. We're here to demand that the mayor declare a climate emergency. I'm the father of 2 girls. I want them to have a future in New York City, but it looks like the city's going to be flooded underwater unless the mayor declares emergency. I'm prepared to get arrested so my kids will have a future. The only way change ever happens in this country is if people put their bodies on the line.
The New York City Council will vote today on legislation to drastically slash the emissions of big buildings, mandating a 40% emissions reduction by 2030 that would rise to 80% by 2050. Buildings generate 2/3 of the New York City's emissions. The city is one of the first in the U.S. to heed the Green New Deal's call to upgrade all existing buildings to be more energy efficient. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Narmeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The push for the Green New Deal continues to build momentum in the United States. Backers of the bill are launching a nationwide tour tonight to build support for the congressional resolution which seeks to transform the U.S. economy through funding renewable energy while ending U.S. carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. 2 Massachusetts lawmakers, Democratic Senator Ed Markey and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, are launching the Green New Deal tour at an event tonight in Boston. Meanwhile, the online news outlet, The Intercept, has just unveiled a short illustrated video featuring Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the New York congressmember who introduced the Green New Deal in the House.
It's titled A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's set decades in the future as Ocasio-Cortez looks back at the Green New Deal's impact on the country. It features stunning artwork by award-winning illustrator Molly Crabapple. We'll play the video in a moment, but first we turn to Intercept senior correspondent Naomi Klein, who helped make the film. She's the author of many books, including This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. At an event celebrating the 5th anniversary of The Intercept Tuesday night, Naomi Klein discussed the making of the video.
In December, the debate about the Green New Deal was starting to heat up, and it was starting to get ugly. And as you all know, for the past 4 months, it has been attacked by the serious center and the far right and the absolutely unhinged right, and here and there from the left with some legitimate critiques. But for those of us who really want the Green New Deal to succeed, want it to be the best that it possibly can be, see it as basically our last hope for a livable planet. Molly and I were thinking about how do we kind of do an end run around this misinformation campaign and produce some art and involve artists in the Green New Deal itself. And what Molly and I were talking about is that, first of all, art is low-carbon work. These are green jobs. You know, green jobs aren't just guys putting up solar panels. And when we think back to the original New Deal in the 1930s, one of the things that was really amazing about it was that it led to this renaissance of publicly funded art. Hundreds of thousands of murals, all of these incredible films and theater pieces, and artists were treated as workers like any other. The original New Deal was also under relentless attack by the press. There was actually a coup, a sloppy coup, banker's coup, to try to overthrow FDR. The reason why it didn't matter and the popularity still soared was, first of all, it was helping people, but also it had its own communication. And artists were out there, and they were all in for the Green New Deal. And so Molly said, I would love to make a video with AOC. And we started thinking about what that should communicate and what we should be trying to do. And what we realized was that the biggest problem we are up against when we think about doing something as transformative as science demands is the sense of futility that people have because they're told all the time that it's impossible, that they're just greedy, that they're just going to spend their whole lives on the couch watching walruses commit suicide on Netflix and just, let the whole thing wash over them. And it's almost like people think that they don't deserve to be saved. And The Intercept had just a few days earlier published this really wonderful piece by Kate Aronoff, one of our fantastic reporters and writers, and who's been a really important theorist for the Green New Deal. And Kate set this piece in the future, in the year 2045, and she told the story of a fictional young woman named Gina who lived in the world that the Green New Deal created. And it really struck a chord with you readers of The Intercept. And we realized that it was because it was imagining a future that was actually non-apocalyptic, that did not take the apocalypse for granted, like almost every big-budget Hollywood film that we've ever seen, that just imagines the future as like Mad Max, trying to protect your kids from, cannibals and, warlords, right? And so that was what inspired this film. And I'm going to stop talking and let the film talk.
The bullet train from New York to D.C. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old-school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
That's the film, A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, presented by The Intercept and Naomi Klein, and illustrated by award-winning artist Molly Crabapple. The film was co-written by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Avi Lewis, and co-directed by Kim Bookbinder and Jim Batt. After break, we'll be back with Molly Crabapple and Avi Lewis.
We are working for a Green New Deal, so our earth and our air will heal. We will get our power in from the sun and the wind. We are working for a Green New Deal. We're not working for the oil barons who profit from our world's crisis, who pump our atmosphere full of carbon without care. No, we're working for a Green New Deal. We are working for clean air for the future that we share, and clean food at every meal. We'll create good jobs and more, just like they did before, but this time we'll have a Green New Deal. Working for the corporations who pollute without consequence, who would cheer on the decline if it raised their bottom
Green
line.
New Deal by Phil and the Ossifers. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We can be whatever we have the courage to see. That's the message of a stunning new video released by The Intercept, Naomi Klein, and award-winning artist Molly Crabapple Wednesday that imagines a future shaped by the Green New Deal. It's called A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
The film was co-written by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself, along with Avi Lewis, the co-founder of The Leap. He joins us now from Rutgers University, along with award-winning artist Molly Crabapple, who's here in our New York studio. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! The film now has been seen since you released it on The Intercept yesterday by millions of people. Molly, it's a magnificent piece. Explain, especially for both our radio audience who doesn't see the images, but here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking in this fantastical piece that's looking back at when she introduced the Green New Deal decades before.
We wanted to create something that fought against this tendency towards dystopia, towards this tendency to the apocalypse. Me and Naomi and Avi and Kim and Jim and Alexandria, we wanted to create a vision of a hopeful, beautiful future, of a future that we wanted to live in. So we made this animation with the idea that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was rolling into Washington on the new train at some point in the future and thinking back to how she had gotten there, thinking back to how a series of climate disasters, including Puerto Rico, led to the Green New Deal being adopted and led to the country being made a better, more beautiful, more kind and more dignified place.
Puerto Rico, where your father's from?
Yes, my father's from Puerto Rico. I think one of the reasons that this project was so meaningful to me was because both me and Alexandria and probably over a million other New Yorkers, we saw what climate change looks like in real life. We saw that it wasn't just like some theory, something, far off that might happen, in 20 years or 100 years. No, we saw climate change tear through Puerto Rico and kill 2,000 Americans. And I think probably my favorite piece, the piece that was most moving to me to draw, was this image of a house, like a pink, very typical, like casita in the mountains that had been decimated by Maria, but the defiant Puerto Rican flag still there.
Yeah, and in fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's family is also from Puerto Rico, like your father is. And she refers, in the narration, she refers to what happened in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria, as the climate bomb. So can you talk about the significance for you, as for her, of making this, as you say, extremely moving visualization of what occurred?
I think a lot of people, when they look at the magnitude of changes that have to be made to properly fight against climate change, they're like, oh, my God, that's too big, that's too extreme. But for me, and I think for Alexandria and for many other people who saw what happened in Puerto Rico, the other option is unimaginable. The other option is just submitting to having hurricanes periodically kill grandparents or having wildfires periodically burn down houses forever. I think that it was very, very important to us to communicate the urgency. But the other thing that Puerto Rico taught me after Maria was the incredible resilience of people, the way that people who had been completely not just neglected but spat upon by the federal government and by FEMA joined together and created mutual aid centers that cleared the roads, that fed their neighbors, that kept old people alive. And so when me and Kim and Jim and Alexandria and Avi and Naomi were conceiving of this, we didn't just want to capture the bad parts, the horrible things. We wanted to capture the idea that, yes, we can do great things. We can be resilient. We can come together.
And talk about how illustrations, your art, can convey what, perhaps script cannot, because your art is just incredible, and what you're able to represent, both in terms of what's occurring now and a possible future, is very different from what people have ever seen.
I often think that we live in this incredibly image-saturated moment where there's this almost jadedness to photography. I think more photos are taken each year than they were in the entire first 100 years of the history of photography. But drawing, because it's so personal, it can short-circuit that jadedness. It can get around that numbness. What we did with this message from the future was we both showed in kind of like a symbolic and, way what the, past of climate change had looked like, what the research had been, what the present was. But we also were able to show in this very, very concrete way what the future would look like. One of my favorite things to draw for it was I did a picture of Grand Army Concourse, as it would be in 2028 under the Green New Deal. And it kept all of the beautiful old things. I don't want our future to look like Dubai. I don't want our future to mean that we get rid of our history and our culture. But it showed them surrounded with the new things, like solar and with like bullet trains and like rooftops that had been converted into community gardens. So you have, the abuelos on the block, right, playing dominoes, low carbon. But you also have people doing gardening on rooftops.
Avi Lewis, you're speaking to us from Rutgers University. You worked with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the script. Talk about that and how this fits into, we just heard Naomi Klein introducing the film and talking about the actual New Deal and the money that was put into artists. In a moment, we're going to hear Noam Chomsky talk about what the Green New Deal can learn from the New Deal. Your comments.
Well, first of all, Amy, it's so great to be on Democracy Now! And as always, and to share this work of it took about 4 months and a huge effort. I checked the numbers this morning, and it's been seen by more than 4 million people in less than 24 hours. So it's clearly striking a deep, deep nerve with people. And the number of responses we've heard and received about people who are kind of weeping while watching this visual imagining of a more hopeful future, I think is really striking. But listen, as a storyteller and a film and television maker for almost 30 years, I've learned that there's always a huge community of people making a work, most of whom are unseen. In this case, I feel like we should have had like a producer credit for the movements that produced this political moment that this piece is emerging from. Decades of environmental justice work and organizing, particularly in communities that have historically and are currently excluded, organizations and networks like the Climate Justice Alliance, but also the Bernie campaign of 2016 that unleashed big organizing, and the Justice Democrats and the brand new Congress, and of course the extraordinary Sunrise Movement. All of this building of movements on movements created this political moment from which this work of utopian fiction could emerge to strike the imagination of people. Art accesses a different part of us. And I think, even watching headlines this morning, the fight or flight panic that is evidenced in Greta's unleashing of the climate strike movement among young people, the Extinction Rebellion folks, we are living in terrifying times. And for those of us who are committed to vast and rapid change, we're living in a state of engagement that is not fun a lot of the time. And when I see people's responses to this work and the amount of emotion that it's unleashed, I'm really struck by how much we need, not just hope, which, as Obama and politicians like Justin Trudeau reveal, can be a shallow and easily leveraged commodity, but an actual vision. When we have a beautiful art like Molly's, a fully articulated, beautiful vision of the world we're fighting for, we need it. It orients us. It reminds us what we're doing all this work for. And it unleashes incredible political potential as well. I mean, this piece has struck a nerve for a very clear reason. And, getting to work with AOC was an extraordinary opportunity. Having my phone ring at a certain point weeks into the process when I was waiting for a reaction to the first draft of the script, and having the little video call icon flash, and then suddenly be talking to her in her office in Congress. And, having a major restructuring of the first draft. And then I got, in subsequent weeks, 2 full line edits where she'd sat down with the script and done a very intensive rewrite, and then a very collaborative process in recording the narration, where I think we heard a different side of this remarkable, electrifying politician than we've heard, a more internal, a more dreamlike state that she was able to locate in conjunction with the art and the ideas. I think we're living in an extraordinary moment. They're full of peril and promise, and we need this promise nerve to be touched.
And Molly Crabapple, this work that you've done for The Intercept on climate change follows on another remarkable film that you illustrated on the war on drugs with Jay-Z. So can you talk about how that was received and how you hope, what you hope audiences will learn from this film?
Well, I've been lucky enough to spend about 9 years creating films like these with Kim Bookbinder and Jim Batt. They're stop-motion films that take sometimes 30 hours to film and then 100 more hours to edit. And 2015 or 2016 that our collaboration with Dreamhampton and Jay-Z came out, which was about the disparities in the way that black people and white people are treated around drugs. It trended worldwide. It was something that teachers use, that's used in museums, that I think was part of actually changing how people spoke about these sentencing disparities and how people spoke about creating not just marijuana legalization, but justice for all these people that have been locked up in cages because of racist laws. I think our video did a small part of that. And the thing that I think that these videos can do that's very important is that many people, they look at a bunch of graphs, tables, data, long blocks of text, and they're like, this is so depressing, this is so overwhelming, and they just basically stop reading after the headline. Whereas I think what the video does, and when you're watching my hand draw out this past and future, is it pulls people along and it makes them listen.
And the role of art in politics, that idea of what you've been doing all of this time.
I think that for too long, art has been segregated from the rest of the world. It's been locked up in museums the way that you lock up a butterfly in a glass cage, the way that you lock up a dead thing that's no longer relevant. And I think that that is terrible, that art has been cut off from life. Art needs to be in the streets. It needs to be in people's minds. The art world is too small of a place for art. And for me, doing work that's, graffitied on walls or that's held at protests or that chronicles some of the struggles and conflicts of our time, that's part of breaking art out of the cage of the art world.
Well, Molly Crabapple, we thank you for doing just that. Molly Crabapple, award-winning artist and writer. Avi Lewis, thanks for joining us from Rutgers University, co-writer and co-producer of The Intercept's animated film, A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, presented by The Intercept and Naomi Klein. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we hear Noam Chomsky on both the Green New Deal and lessons from the past, as well as what's happening today on the Mueller report. He'll talk about Russiagate. Stay with us.
We are all one people, one people. Oh, we are one. What has happened to my country? It's not the place that I recall. But is it really different now? Or have I just awakened to it all? With mass incarceration, border militarization, poverty and devastation. Can't we have a conversation before one more life is taken? 'Cause we are all one people, 99%.
One Person by Deanna Mullins. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We end today's show with the world-renowned linguist, political dissident Noam Chomsky. I spoke to him last week at the Old South Church in Boston. In a moment, we'll hear Noam Chomsky talk about Russian meddling in the 2016 election and what the Mueller report found and didn't find, which is being released today. But first, I asked Noam Chomsky to talk about the Green New Deal and the lessons of the Old New Deal.
First of all, I think the Green New Deal is exactly the right idea. You can raise questions about the specific form in which Ocasio-Cortez and Markey introduced it. Maybe it shouldn't be exactly this way. It should be a little bit differently. But the general idea is quite right. And there's very solid work explaining, developing in detail exactly how it could work. So a very fine economist at UMass Amherst, Robert Pollin, has written extensively in extensive detail with close analysis of how you could implement policies of this kind in a very effective way, which would actually make a better society. It wouldn't be that you'd lose from it, you'd gain from it. The costs of renewable energy are declining very sharply. If you eliminate the massive subsidies that are given to fossil fuels, they probably already surpass them. There are many means that can be implemented and carried out to overcome, certainly to mitigate, maybe to overcome this serious crisis. So the basic idea is, I think, completely defensible, in fact, essential. A lot of the media commentary ridiculing this and that aspect of it are essentially beside the point. You can change the dates from 2030 to 2040. You can do a couple of other manipulations, but the basic idea is correct. Well, what's the difference from the 1930s? Several things. One thing that's different is large-scale labor action. The 1930s were the period of the organization of the CIO. In the 1920s, the U.S. labor movement had been virtually destroyed. Remember, this is very much a business-run society. American labor history is very violent, quite unlike comparable countries. And by the 1920s, the quite effective militant labor movement had been pretty much crushed. One of the great works of labor history by David Montgomery, one of the great labor historians, is called The Rise and Fall of the American Labor Movement. He was talking about the 1920s, when it had essentially been destroyed. The 1930s, it revived. It revived with large-scale organizing activities. CIO organizing began. The strike actions were quite militant. They led to sit-down strikes. A sit-down strike is a real sign of warning to the business classes, because there's a step beyond a sit-down strike. The next step beyond a sit-down strike is, let's start the factory by running by ourselves. We don't need the bosses. We can run it ourselves. So get rid of them, okay? That's a real revolution, the kind that should take place. The participants in an enterprise would own and run it by themselves, instead of being the slaves of the private owners who control their lives. And a sit-down strike is a bare step away from that. That aroused real fear among the ownership classes. Second element was there was a sympathetic administration, which is very critical. You look at the history of labor actions over the centuries. There's a very good book on this, incidentally, by Eric Loomis, who has a book called American History in 10 Strikes, or some similar name, where he runs through the militant labor actions ever since the early 19th century. And he makes an interesting point. He says every successful labor action has had the support, at least tacit support, of the government. If the government and the ownership classes are unified in crushing labor action, they've always succeeded. Okay? Very significant observation. And in the 1930s, there was a sympathetic administration for many reasons. But that combination of militant labor action, it was a very lively political period in many ways, and a sympathetic administration did lead to the New Deal, which greatly changed people's lives.
Can you share your analysis of President Trump? You have lived through so many presidents. Explain President Trump to us and assess the massive response to him.
Well, Trump is, I think there are a number of illusions about Trump. If you take a look at the Trump phenomenon, it's not very surprising. Think back for the last 10 or 15 years over Republican Party primaries. And remember what happened during the primaries. Each primary, when some candidate rose from the base, they were so outlandish that the Republican establishment tried to crush them and succeeded in doing it. Michelle Bachmann, Herman Cain, Rick Santorum, anyone who was coming out of the base was totally unacceptable to the establishment. The change in 2016 is they couldn't crush him. But the interesting question is, why was this happening? Why, in election after election, was the voting base producing a candidate utterly intolerable to the establishment? And the answer to that is, if you think about that, the answer is not very hard to discover. Since the 1970s, during this neoliberal period, both of the political parties have shifted to the right. The Democrats, by the 1970s, pretty much abandoned the working class. In the last gasp of more or less progressive Democratic Party legislative proposals was the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act in 1978, which Carter watered down so that it had no teeth, just became voluntary. But the Democrats had pretty much abandoned the working class. They became pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Meanwhile, the Republicans shifted so far to the right that they went completely off the spectrum. Two of the leading political analysts of the American Enterprise Institute, Thomas Mann, Norman Ornstein, about 5 or 10 years ago, described the Republican Party as what they called a radical insurgency that has abandoned parliamentary politics. Well, why did that happen? It happened because the Republicans face a difficult problem. They have a primary constituency, a real constituency, extreme wealth and corporate power. That's who they have to serve. That's their constituency. You can't get votes that way, so you have to do something else to get votes. What do you do to get votes? This was begun by Richard Nixon with the Southern strategy, try to pick up racists in the South. The mid-1970s, Paul Weyrich, one of the Republican strategists, hit on a brilliant idea. Northern Catholics voted Democratic, tended to vote Democratic, a lot of them working class. The Republicans could pick up that vote by pretending, crucially, pretending to be opposed to abortion. By the same pretense, they could pick up the evangelical vote. Those are big votes, evangelicals, Northern Catholics. Notice the word pretense. It's crucial. You go back to the 1960s, every leading Republican figure was strongly what we call now pro-choice. The Republican Party position was, that's Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, all the leadership. Their position was abortion is not the government's business. It's a private business. Government has nothing to say about it. They turned almost on a dime in order to try to pick up a voting base on what are called cultural issues. Same with gun rights. The gun rights become a matter of holy writ because you can pick up part of the population that way. In fact, what they've done is put together a coalition of voters based on issues that are basically tolerable to the establishment, but they don't like it. Okay, and they've got to hold those two constituencies together. the real constituency of wealth and corporate power, they're taken care of by the actual legislation. So if you look at the legislation under Trump, it's just lavish gifts to the wealth and the corporate sector. The tax bill, the deregulation, every case in point. That's kind of the job of Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, those guys. They serve the real constituency. Meanwhile, Trump has to maintain the voting constituency with one outrageous position after another that appeals to some sector of the voting base. And he's doing it very skillfully. It's just as a political manipulation, it's skillful. Work for the rich and the powerful, shaft everybody else, but get their votes. It's not an easy trick. And he's carrying it off, and I should say the Democrats are helping him. They are. Take the focus on Russiagate. What's that all about? I mean, it was pretty obvious at the beginning that you're not going to find anything very serious about Russian interference in elections. I mean, for one thing, it's undetectable. I mean, in the 2016 election, the Senate and the House went the same way as the executive, but nobody claims there was Russian interference there. In fact, Russian interference in the election, if it existed, was very slight, much less, say, than interference by, say, Israel. Israel, the prime minister, Netanyahu, goes to Congress, talks to a joint session of Congress without even informing the White House to attack Obama's policies. I mean, that's dramatic interference with elections. Not whatever the Russians tried. It's not going to be anything like that. And in fact, there's no interference in elections that begins to compare with campaign funding. Remember that campaign funding alone gives you a very high prediction of electoral outcome. It's again Tom Ferguson's major work, which has shown this very persuasively. That's massive interference in elections. Anything the Russians might have done is going to be, peanuts and compared. As far as Trump collusion with the Russians, that was never going to amount to anything more than minor corruption. Maybe building a Trump hotel in Red Square or something like that, but nothing of any significance. The Democrats invested everything in this issue. Well, turned out there was nothing much there. They gave Trump a huge gift. In fact, they may have handed him the next election. That's a matter of being so unwilling to deal with fundamental issues that they're looking for something on the side that'll somehow give political success. The real issues are different things. They're things like climate change, like global warming, like the nuclear posture review, deregulation. These are real issues, but the Democrats aren't going after those. They're looking for something else. The Democratic establishment. I'm not talking about the young cohort that's coming in, which is quite different. All of that has to be shifted significantly if there's going to be a legitimate political opposition to the right-wing drift that's taking place. And it can happen, can definitely happen, but it's going to take work.
Well, Noam, the world-renowned linguist and political dissident Noam Chomsky, speaking at the Old South Church in Boston last Thursday night. Go to democracynow.org to see more of the interview and to see his speech. You can go to democracynow.org for our video and audio podcasts, as well as transcripts of all of our shows. Democracy Now! Is an immediate opening for a paid full-time digital fellowship here in New York City. We also are accepting applications for paid 6-month internships. Learn more at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Geister, Carla Wills, Tommy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.